For our children's focus, for those of you who are watching us online, and for our own sort of pleasure, I'm going to ask two people to come forward to act out two parts as I tell the story. I'm going to ask Regina to come and be the sage and wonderful Eli in the Old Testament. Do you think you could come up and be Eli for us? Thank you, Regina. You haven't got much choice, I know. And I wonder, just because you and I are diminutive of stature, Jennifer, could you come and be Samuel? Thank you. So I want to introduce you to Eli. He's wearing exactly the right clothing, and Samuel, you're over here. Now, Samuel is a young boy. He's aged about 6 or 7 years old, okay? He is smaller than me, she. And Eli is pretty ancient, probably nearly as old as Regina is currently. And he has been a servant of the Lord in the temple, enabling worship to happen. And so we're going to imagine that this area behind us is the temple. Now Samuel, we won't go into Samuel's background, but he's got a very moving background story whereby his mother Hannah, who loved him dearly, had never been able to have children, and the Lord miraculously gave her a child, and it was Samuel, and she felt she should give him back to the Lord. So when he got to a certain age, after he'd been weaned, so at age about 4 or 5, he went to the temple, and Eli looked after him, and he learnt how to serve the Lord in the temple. Okay, so we're starting from when he's a little bit older, and it's bedtime. Now, we don't know exactly where they slept, but I'm assuming if Eli was older and perhaps not as able to move around as Samuel was, he might have had a slightly more comfortable bed. So it's bedtime, Eli, so could you just put your bedclothes on? Samuel, you've got similar colour because you're the same order of temple order. Would you like to put your bedclothes on? Is that okay? You should have a... Yeah, here it is. There is a tie around your waist. There we go. So it's bedtime. I don't know what time bedtime was in the temple, but it was probably as it got dark, because there were no other lights other than the light that was shining on the altar. So Samuel, you're going to help Eli get into bed. That's his nice bed over there. So if you could just take him over there and just help him get into bed, because he's a rather elderly gentleman. And then you're going to come and sleep over here. So if you'd like to put him in his seat, give him his pillow and wrap him up in his blanket. That's it. You sit down, Eli. You might want that for your head, the pillow, but feel free not to have it as your head. And then put him to bed. That's it. And then Samuel, you're going to sleep in front of the altar. Okay, so you've actually got a cushion to lie on with a pillow, and you've got your blanket, and because you're 7, 8 years old, you've got your teddy bear with you. Now we all know that teddy bears were only invented about 100 years ago, but I thought we'd bring this up to date. So there's your teddy bear. You get into bed and put your blanket on you. Are you able? You're right down there. And we're fast asleep at night. It's very quiet in the temple at night. But then suddenly, Samuel sits upright and he can hear a voice. And the voice is saying, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel looks around and he thinks, who's that? Are there any burglars in here? And then he thought, no, it must have been my master Eli. So he runs, he gets out of bed and he goes over to Eli and says, yes, Lord, yes, Eli, I'm here. And Eli says to him, why are you here? And Samuel says, because you called me. And Eli says, no, I didn't call you. Go back to bed, Samuel, and go to sleep. So Samuel goes back to bed. Just warn you, Jennifer, this happens 3 times. And goes to sleep with his teddy bear. And once he's fast asleep again, he suddenly wakes up because he hears the voice going, Samuel, Samuel. So Samuel gets out of bed, runs to his master Eli, and says, Eli, Eli, my master, you did call. I've just heard you calling my name. So Eli looks at him and says, no, Samuel, I didn't call your name. Now please let me go to sleep and go back to bed. So Samuel goes back to bed and goes fast asleep. And then he wakes up again and hears the voice going, "Samuel, Samuel, Samuel." He wakes up and he goes to his master Eli and says, "But you did, I'm here." And then suddenly the penny drops for Eli and he says to Samuel, "Well, it's not me you're hearing. I think it must be God. So next time you hear his voice, you are to say to him, 'Here I am, Lord. You have called me.'" And so Samuel goes back to bed and he goes to sleep. And then the Lord came and stood by Samuel and calls before, as he said before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel sat up in bed, he knelt up in bed, and he said, "Lord, speak, for your servant is listening." And then God spoke to him. So shall we give our actors a big round of applause? Thank you very much for your part. So, isn't that an amazing story? This little boy, how many people here can remember being 7 or 8 years old? If you can't remember being 7 or 8. I can remember being 7 or 8 years old. Some of you here aren't even 7 or 8 years old yet. But God spoke to Samuel, even though he was a young boy. So this young boy, and then this older man. Who here is a granny, a grandpa? Who here has got grandchildren? Some of you here. So you know what it feels like to be old and to have little children running around you. And you know, actually, it's really uplifting, isn't it? Until it goes on for about 12 or 13 hours and you think, it's time for you to go home. But it's wonderful to have the little ones and the older ones together. And this story doesn't talk about the majority of us here. It talks about the elderly and the very young, and how together they get to know God better. Because initially, at the beginning, Eli did not realize that Samuel was hearing God's voice. And we don't know why he thought that. Maybe he thought he's too young. Maybe he wasn't used to God speaking. We don't know why. But he didn't think, oh, that must be God. It wasn't until it happened several times, and then Eli suddenly thought, well, if it's not me and there's nobody else here, it must be God. And so he then teaches Samuel, he tells Samuel how to respond, which is to say, "Lord, I am your servant, I am listening." So there's a wonderful, wonderful picture there of how we little ones can be spoken to by God. And actually Samuel became a really, really important person in the history of his people, and I'll tell you more about that later. But he became a very important person because he listened to God. Not famous like people on television or film stars or whatever, but he became very important because he had learnt to listen to God's voice and then to be able to tell other people what God was saying.